He murdered with his own hands in Riga and built a new life of comfort in South America. But Mossad was watching. What looked like casual conversations, friendly dinners, and business offers was in fact the groundwork for one of the most intricate missions undertaken by Israel's intelligence services in the 1960s. After Eichmann's capture in 1960, the question of whether Nazi fugitives should face trial or be executed became a pressing debate. Newly surfaced archival material and survivor testimony have reframed how Mossad pursued collaborators and how far states may go when courts fail. While these debates played out at the policy level, one notorious figure was already living quietly abroad, his past veiled by a carefully maintained public image. The forgotten war criminal living in luxury. In the years following the war, Herbert Cukurs stood out among Nazi fugitives because he was not hiding at all. While many perpetrators assumed new names or slipped into anonymity, he continued to use his own, openly presenting himself as the renowned Latvian aviator who had once captured headlines with daring solo flights. In Brazil and later Uruguay, he cultivated admiration rather than suspicion. To his neighbors, he was not a fugitive, but a pioneer whose exploits in the air echoed a more glamorous past. He ran small businesses, entertained visitors, and lived as if the war years belonged to another life entirely. For those unaware of what had happened in Riga, his reputation offered an unchallenged protective mask. Before the war, Cukurs had genuinely enjoyed fame. In 1933, he piloted a small aircraft he had built himself on a solo journey to Gambia and back, gaining attention across Europe. Later flights took him further, including a long-distance venture to Tokyo that added to his legend. These achievements made him Latvia's most celebrated aviator, with officials proudly sending him abroad as a national symbol. That prestige persisted even in exile. In immigrant-heavy communities of South America, his accent and background were unremarkable, while his aviation record gave him a local status that many found admirable. In photographs he shared of his younger days beside his aircraft, he looked every bit the heroic figure his neighbors believed he was. Survivors of Riga remembered him very differently. They testified that behind the aviator's polished image was a man implicated in mass violence. He has long been accused by survivors and Nazi hunters of personal participation in atrocities during 1941 and 1942. Executions in forests, expulsions, synagogue burnings, and street raids. Some reports and later journalistic accounts claim that responsibility for up to 30,000 Jewish deaths rested at least partly on him. It is important to note that those numbers come from survivor testimony and post-war investigative summaries, not from a courtroom conviction. Nevertheless, for witnesses who had seen families torn apart and entire communities destroyed, his name carried the weight of terror rather than adventure. This sharp contrast created a paradox impossible to ignore. In South America, he strolled freely through city squares, engaged in commerce, and told stories of his flights, embodying dignity in the eyes of many neighbors. In survivor circles, however, he represented brutality and murder. That dissonance could not be reconciled. To know he was still thriving while the memory of the massacres remained raw was viewed as an intolerable affront. The more his comfortable exile became known, the louder survivors demanded that action be taken. By the early 1960s, those demands reached Israel. The dramatic capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina had already demonstrated Mossad's ability to intervene where justice elsewhere had failed, and it laid a precedent that survivors invoked when speaking about Cukurs. Civic groups organized petitions, survivor associations documented testimonies, and articles surfaced in the press pointing to his freedom abroad. Survivor pressure and the global attention from Eichmann's capture pushed Israeli intelligence to act. Public outrage made inaction politically and morally costly. The longer he remained untouched, the more hollow official commitments to memory and justice appeared to those who had lost relatives in Riga. For Israel, the situation carried both symbolic and practical urgency. The state had been founded in part on the promise of security for Jews worldwide and remembrance of Holocaust victims. Allowing a figure like Cukurs to live openly as a minor celebrity undercut that promise. At the policy level, debates continued about the scope of Mossad's mission and the risks of operating abroad. But at the level of public sentiment, especially among survivor networks, the moral line was unmistakable. A man whose name echoed in witness accounts of shootings and synagogue burnings could not be left untouched. Cukurs had chosen to step into South American life with confidence, relying on his past fame to shield him. Ironically, that same choice made him one of the most visible symbols of impunity. For survivors who tracked his movements and urged authorities to respond, he was evidence of the world's failure to confront the past. For Israeli intelligence, he became a test of resolve in the years after Eichmann. The calm exterior of the aviator concealed a record of accusations that survivors refused to allow the world to forget. These accusations did not exist in the abstract. They were made vivid by witness testimony, by refugee accounts gathered in the years after the war, and by memories preserved in personal writings and interviews. Each story chipped away at the public mask and revealed a very different portrait of the man. It was those voices that carried the immediacy of what had been seen in Riga, that ultimately convinced Mossad that waiting for trial or international cooperation would be insufficient. What those witnesses described would shape how Cukurs' name was remembered and why his presence abroad was so intolerable to those demanding justice. Their accounts take us back to the summer of 1941, when the German occupation of Riga dismantled daily life and perpetrators were given free rein to carry out mass violence. It is within those moments, preserved in testimony, that the true gravity of the accusations against Herbert Cukurs becomes clear. Eyewitness accounts, crimes in Riga. When German forces occupied Riga in the summer of 1941, the city's Jewish community was immediately subjected to systematic persecution and waves of violence. Within those months of terror, survivor testimony consistently linked Herbert Cukurs to public atrocities. Unlike many collaborators remembered only in vague terms, his face, voice, and reputation made him identifiable. Across refugee records, interviews, and archival holdings in places like Yad Vashem, his name recurs in descriptions of shootings, synagogue burnings, the Rumbula massacres, and house-to-house raids. What emerges is not an image of a low-level accessory, but of a man whose presence became familiar at the center of violence. Witnesses repeatedly described early shootings in the streets and on the outskirts of Riga. Groups of men, women, and children were gathered at assembly points before being driven into forests or isolated courtyards. Several survivors recalled seeing Cukurs among armed Latvian auxiliaries, pulling people from columns and executing them at point-blank range. The accounts portray a distinctive role, not one of background supervision, but of direct, repeated participation. His stature and notoriety as a pre-war aviator made him readily recognizable. To those who endured those events, it was his willingness to use his own hands, rather than simply pass orders, that fixed his presence in their memory. One of the most striking and often cited allegations concerned the synagogue fires. Testimonies from residents near the Great Choral Synagogue on Gogol Street described how hundreds of Jews were trapped inside when the building was set alight. Witnesses told of guards who opened fire at windows when trapped victims tried to escape. In multiple independent files, Cukurs was named as present on the scene and armed, seen enforcing the cordon and ensuring no one survived the inferno. These testimonies have survived in different forms and remain among the most detailed allegations attached to his name. The horror of those accounts, the cries from inside drowned by flames and gunshots, gave the synagogue attack its place as one of the defining symbols of Riga's destruction. And in those accounts, Cukurs is named again and again. His identification also features prominently in descriptions of the Rumbula killings in late 1941, during which more than 20,000 Jews were murdered in two mass shooting operations just outside Riga. German officers planned the massacres, but Latvian auxiliaries executed much of the labor. Eyewitnesses later recounted seeing Cukurs moving along the lines of victims, shouting instructions, striking Jews as they were forced forward, and shooting those who resisted or fell. Refugees who later gave testimony to investigators placed him unmistakably at Rumbula, citing his recognizable figure amid the carnage. This consistency across accounts is striking. His name surfaces more often than many other auxiliaries, not because of rumor, but because he had already been a recognizable public figure. Smaller scale but equally chilling recollections also describe Cukurs entering homes during raids or turning up at temporary camps. Survivors remembered him dragging residents into the streets, beating them, or selecting individuals for immediate execution. Some recalled him boasting afterward, presenting himself as an authority without hesitation despite lacking formal command. These day-to-day stories underline a pattern. He acted in public, in broad daylight, with the confidence of someone whose reputation gave him license. The behavior described was not hidden work of the bureaucracy, but acts of violence carried out in plain view. What disturbed many survivors as much as the physical violence was his manner. Testimonies often noted that Cukurs showed arrogance, mocking victims, or flaunting his status as Latvia's famed aviator. The contrast between his celebrated past as a pioneer of solo flights and his conduct during 1941 burned itself into memory. For victims who saw him at close quarters, the sight of a national celebrity turned tormentor left deep scars. They carried those details into post-war interviews, recognition blended with betrayal. By the early 1960s, those testimonies had circulated widely in Jewish communities and Excel networks. They informed refugee files and Jewish historical commissions and became part of the archival record preserved in Israel. Scholars and intelligence officers looking back at Riga did not find vague rumor but consistent references across independent witnesses. Recently, more accessible archival testimony has reinforced how frequently his name was mentioned, highlighting recurring themes: public shootings, synagogue burnings, Rumbula, and home raids. At the same time, the evidentiary boundary was clear. Survivor accounts were consistent and harrowing, but efforts within Latvia decades later repeatedly cited difficulties in meeting prosecutorial standards. Legal authorities struggled to frame the testimonies as courtroom-ready evidence, given the scale of time lost and the challenges of corroborating every detail. This created the very dilemma that would later confront Israeli intelligence. Convincing, detailed accounts of crimes existed, yet the path to a conventional trial appeared blocked. For survivors, this problem only added to the pain. Having witnessed killings firsthand, they preserved names, locations, and memories with searing clarity. Yet legal systems often demanded written records from perpetrators themselves or documentation that the passage of time had all but erased. The result was that men who had arrived in South America with visible blood on their hands continued to prosper, shielded by the legal obstacles erected between memory and prosecution. The case of Herbert Cukurs epitomized this gap. On one side lay hundreds of survivor accounts, voices that remembered his face at mass grave, his voice outside burning synagogues, his gun at courtyards. On the other lay the limitations of national courts hesitant to pursue prosecution without corroboration beyond witness memory. The testimony was powerful, but sat precariously in the sphere between historical record and judicial enforceability. For intelligence services, that contrast was central. They were not weighing the abstract possibility of rumor, they were measuring multiple consistent archives that told variations of the same story. Within those reports, Cukurs was no desk planner. He was remembered as an active executioner, someone whose violence was public and demonstrable. That left stark questions of responsibility hanging in the air. And by the early 1960s, Israeli officials had to decide how to address them. Survivor communities made their expectations vocal. Allowing a man accused in this way to live freely in Brazil was intolerable. But international law had proven cumbersome, and national prosecutions too often founded on evidentiary barriers. That tension between testimony preserved with precision and the near impossibility of turning it into a conventional legal case formed the backdrop against which intelligence leaders weighed their response. The conclusion was unavoidable. if the witnesses were to be believed, and their consistency over decades made them impossible to dismiss, then the question of how justice could be served grew sharper with every passing year. Whether through trial or direct intervention, someone would have to act. The testimonies themselves made silence untenable, and their weight would press directly upon Israeli decision-making as intelligence officers in Tel Aviv examined their options in the mid-1960s. Mossad's dilemma, trial or execution. By 1964, Mossad had reached a pivotal test. The agency was still weighing the lessons of its most famous operation 4 years earlier, the capture of Adolf Eichmann from Argentina. That mission had ended with a dramatic trial in Jerusalem, broadcast worldwide, where survivor testimony transformed public understanding of the Holocaust. On paper, some wondered if Cukurs could be handled in the same way: a capture, a trial, and a definitive legal record. But the circumstances they faced were starkly different, and the debate inside Mossad reflected deep hesitation about whether to repeat the Eichmann model or abandon it altogether. The appeal of another trial was obvious. For advocates, a courtroom meant legitimacy. It provided survivors with a chance to speak and gave the world a documented account of crimes that had often been buried. A trial could bring attention to Latvia's massacres, long overshadowed by higher-profile atrocities, and it could maintain Israel's standing as a state of law, not one willing to act only through secret killings. To them, trials carried prestige. They turned testimony into history. But the risks loomed just as clearly. Eichmann's abduction had itself sparked immediate diplomatic protests and even a session before the United Nations, with Argentina condemning Israel for violating sovereignty. Both countries only later agreed to smooth things over, but the precedent lingered. Cukurs' case promised even greater complications. Unlike Eichmann, who had assumed a false name and lived inconspicuously, Cukurs lived openly under his real identity, cultivating contacts and making himself visible in the community. Approaching him for abduction carried unpredictable risks. He kept a weapon, guarded his movements, and surrounded himself with acquaintances who could quickly notice anything unusual. Extracting such a target would require more agents, more time, and more local infrastructure, multiplying the chance of failure. And if Mossad failed, Jewish communities in South America could be left vulnerable to retaliatory anger. Inside headquarters, the discussion distilled into blunt trade-offs. Trial, maximum legitimacy, but also maximum risk, an operation difficult to conceal, slow to deliver results, and certain to provoke protests abroad. Assassination, speed and finality, but a method that raised diplomatic costs and carried its own moral shadow. Internationally, abducting suspects had already been criticized as a breach of sovereignty and human rights. Another such operation risked fierce condemnation and strained alliances in an already tense Cold War landscape. For the more cautious voices, the legal questions alone undercut the trial option. Where would Cukurs even be brought? Eichmann's capture had required elaborate justifications to the international community. Repeating that process in Brazil or Uruguay, states far less invested in tolerating a breach, might not be possible. A public trial could stall before it even began, blocked by international protest or left mired in contentious legal wrangling. Worse, it might invite spirited defenses that turned the spotlight onto revisionist claims and reopened wounds survivors had long tried to close. For the others, the weight of survivor testimony pressed more urgently. Witness after witness had placed Cukurs at shootings, at synagogues set ablaze, at the Rumbula massacre. His hands, according to those memories, were not distanced from orders typed in an office, but stained directly from carrying out violence. Every month he lived undisturbed in South America added insult. Much of the evidence was based on testimony rather than surviving documents, which made a trial uncertain. What if he were acquitted? What if the absence of paper trails allowed competent defense lawyers to water down the charges? For those most sensitive to survivor accounts, delay and risk of acquittal were intolerable. The strategic calculations ran in parallel with emotional ones. Many Mossad operatives were themselves bound to Holocaust memory as children of survivors or as men who had encountered refugee testimony firsthand. Reports of Cukurs mocking victims at burning synagogues or striking Jews in the streets struck more sharply than bureaucratic culpability. Some within the service believed no legal forum could weigh crimes of that nature with appropriate gravity. Assassination, grim though it was, promised certainty in a way courts could not. Nor was this debate abstract. Intelligence reports in the early 1960s described remnants of pro-Nazi networks in South America, spreading propaganda, attempting to influence immigrant circles, and cloaking themselves in the years' passage. Allowing a man as publicly recognizable as Cukurs to live without consequence risked becoming a rallying point for denial. A public trial might ironically provide him with a stage for revisionist defenders to mount arguments and muddy the waters. For some, silencing him outright closed that door. No speeches, no defense, no theatrics, just an end. Mossad officers also remembered the storm around Eichmann's capture. The months after the Buenos Aires operation had forced the agency and the state into uncomfortable positions, defending themselves on the international stage. For intelligence professionals, the political turbulence had been more taxing than the operation itself. Some did not want to live through another cycle of accusations, sovereignty disputes, and courtroom grandstanding. Covert execution left fewer questions. It would be deniable, direct, and final. The world might murmur, but it would not convene emergency sessions to debate sovereignty once again. As the deliberations stretched, the split resolved into two frames. The first was the hope of legitimacy, a trial that might set historical records straight, amplify survivor voices, and project Israel as committed to law. The second was the pull of pragmatism, assassination to avoid diplomatic upheaval, protect Jewish communities from fallout, and impose certainty where courts might hesitate. In weighing them, Mossad leadership recognized that the world had changed since 1960. Israel no longer had the benefit of surprise. Latin American governments were on alert, and Cukurs, public life meant surveillance would be conspicuous and operations harder to hide. Ultimately, those realities drained momentum from the trial vision. The diplomatic clashes after Eichmann, the public nature of the target, the difficulty of logistics, and the fragile position of Jewish immigrants in South America all pressed heavily. Operation by courtroom might project moral clarity, but it could also bring months of chaos and risk without a guarantee of conviction. Eliminating Cukurs outright offered no spectacle, but it promised closure. By late 1964, the decision had hardened. There would be no repeat of the Eichmann spectacle, no second global trial, no slow relitigation of Riga's atrocities on the world stage. Mossad concluded that Cukurs would never walk into a Jerusalem courtroom. His end would be decided elsewhere. That ruling created a new challenge. If justice was to be carried out in silence, then silence required disguise. Agents could not simply surround Cukurs in the open, nor could they strike recklessly without eroding their own credibility. Any mission would depend entirely on craft, on the careful construction of a cover story capable of drawing him in and holding him close long enough for the operation to succeed. The choice to eliminate Herbert Cukurs demanded more than resolve. It required a plausible partner who could move close without ever appearing suspicious. For this, Mossad assigned an operative a new identity, Anton Kunzler, an alias used throughout the mission. To this day, the agent's true name has not been disclosed. Kunzler, on paper, was an Austrian businessman with interests in aviation and international investments, credible enough to attract attention, but ordinary enough to avoid scrutiny. Years of tradecraft were compressed into this false biography, complete with references to Viennese firms, financial correspondence, and company seals that looked authentic down to the texture of ink on paper. Everything was meant to stand up to casual checks by a man who had grown used to spotting deception. Building this legend was not a theatrical exercise, but a practical one. Mossad had no use for costumes or flamboyant disguises. The task was to withstand long interaction with a cautious target. To make the alias durable, every detail of Anton Kunzler's supposed life was rehearsed. Agents drilled accent and vocabulary until his German registered as natural, not learned. He committed phrases about airports and flight paths to memory, ensuring he could inject technical talk into conversation at will. Aviation, after all, was the hook. Cukurs craved not just money but recognition, reminders that his early flying adventures still resonated. In practice sessions, the operative was taught to answer as easily about aircraft models as about hotel lounges, shifting between the mundane and the technical the way any well-traveled businessman might. The aim was not to impress, but to pass unnoticed, to make the story seem too ordinary to invite deeper questioning. Mossad's analysts had identified Cukurs' pride and financial strain as key entry points. He was no longer wealthy. His small ventures in Brazil had delivered mixed results, and establishing footholds in aviation projects proved difficult without serious capital. Yet his public persona as Latvia's legendary pilot remained a source of vanity. It was this tension, financial insecurity mixed with longing for recognition, that the Kunstler identity was designed to exploit. Approaches would never be direct sales pitches. Instead, the Austrian businessman appeared gradually in social spaces, showing just enough interest in aviation opportunities to stir curiosity. Whispers of possible funding were allowed to reach Cukurs through acquaintances before Kunstler himself extended a hand. The material to support such claims went beyond surface appearances. Mossad fabricated bank records, drafted letters of intent for partnerships, and even constructed letterheads and stamps from companies in Austria that never existed. These fragments created a paper world in which Kunstler conducted real business. Business cards, embossed stationery, and correspondence added weight to his presence. They could be examined, questioned, passed from one contact to another, each piece reinforcing the illusion that behind the man stood tangible capital. Mossad's goal was not to overwhelm with generosity, but to project enough authority to appear selective. This was how wealthy Europeans were imagined to behave: cautious, probing, demanding evidence of seriousness before parting with funds. That behavior itself made the disguise convincing. The agent's preparation focused as much on behavior as on documentation. Survival in such an operation depended on rhythm, how quickly a question was answered, how silence could be used without arousing alarm, how caution could be read as professionalism rather than fear. Training covered both conversation and demeanor. He was taught to deflect probing without denial and to acknowledge danger without ever showing vulnerability. If suspicion flickered, he would not explain too much but wait calmly, allowing interest in future opportunities to redirect attention. Agents summarized this discipline in blunt terms. Credibility was not created by costumes, but by managing interaction under pressure. Greed and vanity formed the twin levers of approach. Kunstler did not simply dangle money, but hinted at recognition, praising Cukurs' past feats as a pilot and treating him as someone worthy of renewed enterprise. Introducing aviation terms, flattering his technical knowledge, and evoking memories of his long-distance flights provided the psychological payoff his exile had denied him. Each conversation anchored Cukurs more firmly in the fantasy that another chance at aviation glory was opening. His pride in those flights, from Gambia to Tokyo, made it difficult to resist. At the same time, Kunstler never arrived as a savior handing solutions. His posture was cautious. He examined figures, delayed commitments, and questioned terms the way serious investors did. If he had been too eager, Cukurs might have sensed manipulation. Instead, the studied hesitation conveyed legitimacy. The rhythm of business negotiation, offers weighed, doubts raised, partial concessions given, created the impression that these talks were just one of many, that Kunstler approached them with the detachment of a man who handled investments routinely. That detachment made the potential rewards seem even more real. Trust was not meant to come quickly. Mossad's instructions emphasized that the alias had to become ordinary in Cukurs' life before anything decisive could occur. Familiarity was the armor. The Austrian businessman appeared at dinners, exchanged letters, reappeared at gatherings, always consistent, always plausible. It was in those repetitions that suspicion eroded. Bursts of aviation jargon reminded Cukurs of his own youth, while talk of cautious capital made the partnership feel grounded. In these patterned interactions, the cover stopped feeling like a display and became, in the target's eyes, part of his own daily world. The result was a mask that did not look like disguise. For Cukurs, there was no hint of theater. Kunzler behaved as any other European entrepreneur might, equipped with stamped papers, cautious probing, and just enough respect for his aviation past to stroke his ego. The identity held because it never strained credibility. It was not about dazzling deception, but about crafting consistency that felt unremarkable. This was how infiltration succeeded. Through patience, through detail, through the fusion of fiction with the expectations of real life. By the time the groundwork was in place, the Austrian investor existed as more than a file or performance. For Herbert Cukurs, he was a living acquaintance, someone whose handshake conveyed opportunity, whose presence at social tables seemed natural, and whose attention promised both financial relief and rehabilitated status. That illusion would now be tested in person, in encounters where suspicion, paranoia, and greed collided, and where every pause or gesture could alter the outcome. The dance of trust and suspicion. In São Paulo, Mossad allowed the relationship to form in increments. Contacts began in places where expatriates gathered, introduced through business chatter and shared interest in aviation. The operative, under the alias Anton Kunzler, appeared casual, never pressing too quickly and always withdrawing before curiosity turned to suspicion. Cukurs, cautious by nature, accepted the company of another European who spoke German and seemed genuinely interested in flying. Each meeting felt ordinary on the surface, trading stories, flattering his old achievements, exploring small investment possibilities. Yet behind these exchanges lay rehearsed control. The objective was simple: make the contact seem too mundane to arouse alarm. Suspicion was inevitable. Cukurs lived in an environment shaped by risk, carrying a weapon, watching his visitors carefully, and testing them in ways that blurred into social rituals. He was known to stage shooting contests or probe acquaintances with sudden shifts in conversation, watching how they responded. On some occasions, he introduced references to his wartime past, vague and ambiguous, less memory than a test of how his guest might react. Mossad had prepared Kunzler for such moments. He matched interest with restraint, responded without judgment, and held his composure during these private trials. It was a game of balance, knowing that a single misplaced word could end the contact immediately. Slowly, pride and financial strain tilted the balance in Mossad's favor. Cukurs' ventures in Brazil had faltered, leaving him eager for new backing. More than money, he wanted recognition, a reminder that his past as Latvia's celebrated aviator still impressed Europeans abroad. Kunzler delivered both, praising his earlier flights while presenting realistic suggestions of investment. Mossad deliberately exploited these vulnerabilities: pride in his fame, fear of decline, and the lure of financial rescue. Over shared meals and repeated meetings, these threads of flattery and economic promise began to outweigh his instinct for suspicion. The revolver still lay within reach, but its threat dulled each time conversation ended without incident and opportunity seemed closer at hand. The growing familiarity shifted his posture. Interactions became regular, no longer limited to public gatherings. He welcomed Kunzler into spaces reserved for trusted acquaintances, sharing not only schemes for aviation ventures, but glimpses into his personal worries. For Mossad, this was the sign of progress. He was leaning into dependence, accepting that partnership might restore the status he once possessed. Even when questions arose, his need for support pulled him back into conversation. It was not sudden or dramatic, but each meeting left him slightly more invested in what Kunzler represented. Real threshold came when business talk extended beyond São Paulo. After weeks of sustained contact, Cukurs agreed to accompany his supposed investor on a trip, framing it as a chance to inspect options abroad. The offer aligned with his hopes: potential land for enterprises, the promise of backing, the echo of his past in aviation. Agreeing to travel together marked more than a business step. It signaled trust, however fragile, in the very person who had been carefully placed to ensnare him. For Mossad, this decision marked the opening of a new phase. The operative had cultivated familiarity, balanced suspicion against vanity, and secured the willingness of the target to move into unfamiliar territory. Now, the challenge shifted from persuasion to planning. Moving Cucurs beyond Brazil carried both opportunity and risk. The operation would need to adapt quickly, choosing an environment where control could be maintained and consequences contained. Because once he agreed to step beyond his own ground, the stakes became immeasurably higher. The shift to Uruguay. The move out of Brazil and into Uruguay was not improvised, but shaped by months of operational judgments inside Mossad. São Paulo had provided the opening, but it carried hazards that could not be ignored. Brazil was home to one of the largest Jewish populations in South America, living under fragile security conditions. Any violent act or botched operation risked sparking retaliation that would fall directly on that community. Leadership judged that outcome unacceptable. Added to this was the city's size and scale, with a sprawling German-speaking diaspora that included former Nazis and sympathizers, making clean surveillance nearly impossible. If something went wrong in Brazil, Mossad agents would not only lose the mission, but likely ignite retaliation against those they were supposed to protect. Uruguay presented the opposite calculation. Montevideo was smaller, its streets and movements easier to watch, and planning teams considered the local political environment less intrusive. Surveillance and escape routes could be designed with far more control than in São Paulo. Operatives also noted that Uruguay did not pose the same risks of mass reprisals against Jewish residents due to its much smaller Jewish population. And planners judged its legal climate to be safer for them if matters spilled into public, less threatening, even if not legally predictable, than what they feared in Brazil. Such judgments are drawn from operational post-mission accounts and contemporary intelligence tradecraft. They reflect Mossad's risk calculus rather than a formal legal justification. To those shaping the mission, Montevideo offered the best combination of manageable terrain and reduced political and social risk. But the target was human, not geographic. Cukurs still carried caution despite his vanity and greed. To pull him from his routines in Brazil meant crafting a scenario that seemed natural. Kunzler became the channel for that lure, hinting at deals and contacts waiting in Uruguay. European investors, he suggested, had signaled interest but demanded discretion. The message was consistent. Montevideo was not a detour, but the crossroads of opportunity. Cukurs' financial insecurity and his longing for the validation of his pre-war aviation fame made the story persuasive. Soon his own imagination did much of the work, convincing him that business across the border was a rational step toward revival. Once his agreement was drawn out, Mossad turned to preparation on the ground. The team scouted for a location that combined privacy with plausible normality. A busy hotel or boarding house would bring employees and records. An apartment block meant too many curious neighbors. They needed a detached property where control could be absolute. Ultimately, a villa in a quiet Montevideo neighborhood was selected and rented under false identities. The interior was stripped and reconfigured. Rooms were left open to allow space for confrontation. Heavy blinds covered windows to prevent sightlines from adjoining houses. Furniture was arranged with practical calculation, minimizing obstacles should a struggle occur. According to survivor accounts and post-operation files, even a large trunk was prepared in the garage, its dimensions concealed under the guise of household storage, but in reality designed to contain a body should events proceed to that outcome. While later accounts recount this detail, verification from archives is essential if referenced in documentary form. The operation extended beyond the villa. More personnel were introduced into Montevideo. Their arrivals staggered to avoid suspicion. They blended into city life as businessmen, tourists, and expatriates, each waiting for specific instructions. Their tasks ranged from logistic support, such as securing transport and mapping dock routes, to serving as shadow coverage to monitor the target's movements once he entered Uruguay. Maps were drawn, safe houses identified, fallback options listed. If matters broke down, immediate extraction methods were calculated in advance. taxi firms with discreet drivers, routes to border crossings less patrolled, vessels available to leave through the port. The city itself became an instrument of planning, broken down into predictable routes and contingencies. Secrecy was enforced at a level few operations could match. Communication relied on visual cues, agreed hand signals, and prearranged words dropped into ordinary conversation. Papers or codes used only once were immediately destroyed. Any signal traffic risked interception that could unravel the whole effort. By reducing messages to the smallest possible footprint, brief exchanges at markets, gestures made in passing, the operation aimed to leave nothing in the city that investigators could later connect. Discipline governed every interaction. For operatives, the less that existed on paper or on tape, the less could be used if the mission collapsed into scandal. Time was not on their side. Each new meeting between Cukurs and Kunzler strengthened the bond, but also introduced the risk of someone else noticing unusual patterns. Neighbors in São Paulo had lives of their own, but unexplained regularity might one day attract unwanted interest. Leadership grew aware that opportunities could close if the operation dragged on. By February 1965, intelligence officers judged that conditions in Uruguay were stable and distractions in local politics high enough to mask foreign presence. Waiting longer might have risked alerting Cukurs to the hints of Nazi hunters sometimes mentioned in South American papers. If he fled deeper into the continent, the mission could vanish. Tension sat heavily, even in the final days. Cukurs could still withdraw, invent excuses, or test his would-be partner once more. Mossad operatives rehearsed contingencies, repeating the story with small new details to maintain credibility. German-speaking contacts waiting in Montevideo, more accommodating business laws for aviation projects, and future links to Atlantic trade routes. Each point was designed to anchor the promise in believable specifics rather than in vague flattery. The more natural those details sounded, the more difficult they were for Cukurs to resist. For Mossad, persuading him to cross into Uruguay marked the decisive step. Once he entered Montevideo, the operation condensed into a single line of action. Surveillance expanded on his travel routes, operatives shadowed his movements into the city, and eyes watched the streets near the rented villa without ever standing close enough to be noticed. The mission to this point had depended on patience, delay, and careful deception. What followed would depend on precision, control, and timing. February 1965 set the moment. Brazil and its risks were gone. Uruguay had been transformed into the setting for the endgame. The villa waited, its rooms configured, its windows sealed, its spaces calculated not for living but for confrontation. The men assigned knew the cost of failure, exposure of Israel's reach in Latin America, diplomatic uproar, and the collapse of networks built quietly for years. Yet the decision was made. Their work in Montevideo prepared silent ground for what would follow. And soon that ground would no longer be rehearsal. It would become the stage itself, the place where the plan shifted from preparation to action. The operation unfolds. The villa in Montevideo had been selected for one reason only: containment. By February 1965, the rented house, outwardly a modest middle-class residence in a quiet neighborhood, had been stripped of normal comforts and rebuilt as an operational site. Heavy blinds sealed the windows, denying any view to outsiders. Inside, the cleared central room served as the designated encounter space, its layout rehearsed repeatedly so that no movement felt uncertain. Testimonies and later accounts describe the team drilling precise sequences, locking doors, cutting off sightlines, subduing a resistant man quickly before sound could draw attention. Their preparation went beyond posture or grip. A trunk, custom-built and disguised as a shipping container in the garage, was designed to suppress evidence. Around it, everyday tools and spare clothes were left ready, camouflage for neighbors who might otherwise glance too closely. The villa, in short, had been engineered not as a home, but as a controlled environment, silent, purposeful, and stripped to necessity. Just as much effort went into planning how to leave. Exit routes were memorized and rehearsed on the ground, not just mapped on paper. One team counted time to the docks at different hours, Another walked the path through the bus station under false names, while a third rehearsed taxi movements to avoid suspicion from dispatchers. Every operative carried a practiced excuse if stopped: businessmen scouting exports, tourists straying from maps, Austrians seeking consular advice. They spoke of this not as one plan, but as a set of shifting branches, each covering the collapse of another. At the same time, communication discipline ruled. Instructions were pared down to hand signals, brief phrases, and single-use notes burned immediately after use. Mossad had built not just an assassination plan, but a web of redundancies designed to keep agents alive if the villa became compromised. One tactical scare threatened to undo all this preparation. Before departing Brazil, Cukurs expressed hesitation. Sources describe him wavering, perhaps from vague rumors of Nazi hunters circulating in expatriate circles, or from unease, leaving half-settled ventures in São Paulo. At one point, he nearly cancelled. For Mossad, the consequences would have been damaging. Months of work and infrastructure in Uruguay placed at risk of exposure. The operative under the Kunzler alias countered by pushing urgency, insisting investors in Montevideo expected him personally, and that delay could cost future opportunities. He reinforced Cukurs' pride as well, stressing how his reputation as Latvia's aviator gave him unique standing in such negotiations. Pride, mixed with the lure of business promises, overcame the doubts. Hesitation subsided, and he agreed to travel. His arrival in Montevideo triggered the surveillance net. Plainclothes operatives followed him at a distance across transit points, marking his movements as he renewed contact with Kunzler. They avoided patterns, changing pace and coverage, so he remained unaware of a protective circle drawing around him. Meetings were staged casually. Meals, coffees, long stretches of talk about familiar projects, all designed to make his journey feel routine. Each ordinary detail was important. Every successful hour without disruption brought him closer to whatever waited behind the villa's blinds. On the day arranged for confrontation, the house itself entered a final stage of readiness. Inside, positions were set, furniture reduced to what was strictly functional, papers laid out to formalize the script Mossad intended to follow. Accounts later confirmed that these included written charges, statements prepared to be spoken before any violence began, an attempt to mirror justice even in a clandestine act. The operatives moved quietly to their posts, each knowing exactly when to step forward and how to block escape routes. Outside, the street presented its usual scene of neighborhood calm. Neighbors saw only another closed house on an ordinary day. Nothing indicated that a confrontation was minutes away. When Kunzler led Cukurs to the gate, layers of paranoia were visible. He walked cautiously, glanced down the street, and kept a hand close to his revolver. Inside the doorway, he still probed for inconsistencies, ownership of the house, reasons investors might choose this property. Each answer was delivered with the same practiced calm, enough to guide him further in. As he advanced through the villa's spaces, suspicion remained but never hardened into refusal. He passed into the cleared room, without realizing its stark emptiness marked him as its focus. What awaited there was not another conversation. The operatives, silent and in position, had narrowed every option down to a single controlled outcome. Step by step, he had been moved into the center, and now the plan turned upon its most difficult phase. The months of deception and patience had led him here, and in that cleared room, the next moment would determine not only the success of the mission, but the survival of every man inside. It was at this point that the operation crossed its threshold. What followed would be the decisive clash, the point where words ended, resistance began, and Mossad's plan met the full reality of the target they had drawn into their reach. The violent struggle. When Cukurs stepped into the cleared room, events moved from deception into confrontation. A chair waited at the center, and sheets of paper lay on the table. According to accounts later made public, one operative began to read the charges prepared for that moment. A declaration of guilt intended both to confront him and to echo the voices of survivors. The words named the massacres in Riga, the synagogue fires, and the shootings in the forests. But the formal statement never reached its conclusion. Cukurs reacted instantly, lunging forward with sudden violence that broke the rhythm of what had been rehearsed so carefully. Multiple post-mission accounts describe a violent struggle during which agents had to respond with force. He threw aside the chair, struck out at the man closest to him, and reached for the revolver he had carried into the house. Anticipating the risk, operatives rushed to block his arms, but the clash tore through the room in a way drills had not captured. The secrecy of the plan dissolved into the noise of boots scraping tiles and bodies wrestling. Instead of a controlled tribunal, the scene was chaos. His physical strength surprised them. Even in middle age, he fought with desperate force. He lashed out at those holding him down, elbows and fists striking with enough power to stagger the agents around him. Efforts to pin him against the table failed, and the struggle sprawled across the floor. One agent tried binding his arms with a cord, but Cukurs broke the hold, dragging men down with him. Furniture splintered as bodies slammed into it, sharp sounds puncturing the air. What had been designed as a swift, silent operation became a life-and-death fight measured in seconds. At one point, witnesses recalled, he nearly reached the door. An operative blocked his path just in time, both men crashing hard against the wall. His revolver remained the greatest danger. Each attempt to wrest it free risked disaster. Finally, after repeated blows, the pistol wrenched loose and skittered across the floor. That small victory shifted the fight, but did not end it. He kept kicking, thrashing, and shouting through the cloth pressed against his mouth. Every second raised the risk that someone outside the villa might hear. Discipline held, but the agents were straining against a man determined not to be taken quietly. Cords were finally forced around his arms, but even restrained, he fought with bursts of violent resistance. The charges lay unread on the floor, abandoned. Sweat, broken furniture, and blood across the tiles marked the collapse of control. The agents had come prepared to act with grim formality. Instead, they were locked in raw survival, forced into a direct battle that could not be contained by rehearsed words or planned gestures. When his movements continued with undiminished force, the team shifted from restraint to deadly action. That moment, brief but decisive, ended the prolonged clash. Shots were fired. The reports echo in sources as both deliberate and final, an end to resistance that could no longer be contained. The villa fell silent in the wake of the noise. The aftermath was stark. Silence returned to the cleared room, broken only by the heavy breaths of the men who remained standing. Cukurs lay dead on the floor, the revolver beside him useless. The intended ritual, the full reading of charges to a condemned man, had been lost in the violence. Blood stained the smooth tiles, mute evidence of how fiercely he had resisted. The sheets meant to anchor the moment with words were torn, their lines unfinished. Inside that silence, the agents confronted the reality of the mission's outcome. They had prevailed, but only through a struggle far harsher than rehearsals had allowed. The formality had been stripped away, leaving the raw scene of violent death in its place. Outside the villa, the neighborhood remained undisturbed, unaware that one of the most relentless manhunts of the post-war years had just ended in its midst. The struggle had ended. The man who for decades had walked free was no longer alive. Yet for Mossad, the operation reached only its midpoint. Killing him was one part of the plan. What followed next would matter as much as the act itself, because silence was not the objective. Their task was not only to bring Cukurs down, but to decide how the world would learn it had been done. Message to the world. When the villa fell silent and the struggle was over, the operation entered a new phase. The body was not hidden in secret or discarded without trace. Instead, it was placed deliberately inside a trunk alongside papers prepared in advance. These included an anonymous statement, written in stark language, setting out the accusations against Herbert Cukurs, his presence at shootings in Riga, the synagogue fires, the killings tied to his name. Contemporary press reports confirm that letters were dispatched to police, journalists, and consular officials, describing him as a murderer and explaining why he had been executed. No signature, no organization, just the assertion that justice had been delivered to one of Riga's most infamous collaborators. It was not simply a physical act of killing, it was coupled with a message meant for the outside world. the local discovery quickly fulfilled its intended effect. Within days, Uruguayan authorities opened the trunk, found the body, and identified him without doubt. Cukurs had not lived in disguise. His face and name were still recognized by immigrants, aviators, and reporters alike. Photographs circulated immediately in Montevideo and spread across South America. By the time European newspapers printed the pictures, the contrast was starkly drawn. Here was the man celebrated in the 1930s for long-distance flights to Gambia and Tokyo, now labeled the Butcher of Riga. For those who had never heard his name, the juxtaposition provoked shock. For those who remembered survivor testimony, it affirmed that one of the central figures accused of atrocities had met a violent end, not in court, but in a villa hundreds of miles away from his crimes. Reactions unfolded along familiar lines. In Israel, survivors of the Riga massacres voiced grim satisfaction. For years, they had demanded recognition of Cukurs' crimes, and his sudden death felt like evidence that their voices had been heard. In South America, the killing unsettled governments already wary of Mossad's presence and methods. Diplomatic questions circulated about sovereignty and foreign intrusion. Some demanded formal inquiries, though the operational team had already left Uruguay. In Europe, the coverage was split. Editorials in some papers condemned the bypassing of legal procedures and warned of the dangers of assassination as a substitute for trials. Yet others pointed to the record of stalled prosecutions. They noted that in nearly 2 decades no court had managed to bring Cukurs to justice, and absent this intervention, he would likely have lived out a natural life abroad without ever facing cross-examination or verdict. The backlash touched Jewish communities in South America directly. Reports from the time described protests and heated accusations, mixed with isolated acts of harassment. Some anti-Jewish graffiti was recorded in Montevideo, as well as threats aimed at synagogues. A handful of incidents of vandalism and intimidation occurred in the weeks following the discovery of Cukurs' body, though large-scale reprisals or widespread violence did not follow. The association in some local circles between Israel's operation and nearby Jewish communities was immediate, even though those communities had played no role. Community leaders faced the burden of explaining events they had not controlled, while also working quickly to protect congregations feeling exposed to accusations of complicity. The strain was real, but remained contained. Internationally, the political implications deepened quickly. Eichmann's abduction in 1960 had already set a precedent, sparking protests from Argentina and debate in the United Nations about sovereignty and the rule of law. The killing of Cukurs reopened those concerns in a new form. Again, governments asked whether Israel had acted within acceptable limits of international behavior or whether its intelligence services had disregarded the structures of law that protect borders. Official responses avoided naming Israel directly, since no conclusive evidence placed Mossad on Uruguayan soil, but speculation in diplomatic circles was constant. The precedent from Eichmann lingered. If one state could abduct or kill outside its borders without consequence, what would prevent others from attempting the same? At the same time, events in Montevideo resonated back into European politics, particularly in West Germany. For years, German prosecutors had struggled with the statutes of limitation that threatened to close the window for pursuing Nazi war crimes. Heated debates in Parliament focused on whether to extend deadlines or let them expire, which would effectively end prosecutions. The assassination of Cukurs added urgency. Commentators argued that failure in the courts left space for others to take justice into their own hands. Legislators cited the event explicitly in sessions where extensions were discussed. Within days of reports from Uruguay, momentum grew around the proposal to push back the deadlines. The eventual extension kept the door open for new trials into the 1970s. Though the legislation already had support, the sudden reminder of Cukurs' impunity and his violent end abroad lent striking weight to the argument that courts must not falter. His death, in that sense, played into policy outcomes that influenced how Europe confronted its wartime culpability. For Uruguay itself, the discovery left investigators with fragments but no closure. Police photographed fingerprints and recovered materials from the villa, but none were sufficient to produce usable charges against specific individuals. Observers noted that the evidence suggested foreign involvement, yet clear attribution was impossible. Israeli involvement circulated as strong rumor among journalists, among diplomats, among intelligence contacts, but hard proof was lacking. Meanwhile, the suspects had already left the country, and officials were left inspecting an empty villa with only a body and unsigned declarations to connect to any broader framework. The silence of official attribution was deliberate. Mossad's design had always been to leave traces vague enough to avoid clean accountability. The message was therefore less about secrecy than about projection. It demonstrated that Mossad could reach into South America, execute a mission, and leave behind both a corpse and a statement of guilt. The ambiguity suited them. The world knew who was responsible, yet could not prosecute a state that had covered its tracks. For critics, this eroded the legitimacy Israel had built through Eichmann's highly public trial. For supporters, it represented the grim necessity of justice when courts failed. Newspapers captured the contradiction within their own pages. Headlines condemned Cukurs as a mass murderer, while editorials debated whether the method of his death advanced or undermined justice. The tension between justice and sovereignty, law and vengeance, was at the core of international reaction. Historians later remarked on the symbolism embedded in this moment. The operation reminded the world that the Holocaust was not a crime executed solely by commanding officials in Berlin. It had relied on collaborators across occupied Europe, people who acted visibly in their own towns and cities. Cukurs' case illustrated that local agency. His revolver, his orders, his actions in Riga could not be dismissed as minor. Without some confrontation of figures like him, post-war memory risked collapsing into myths that only a handful held responsibility. The anonymous note left with his body was designed to press that recognition into the public arena. The impact of that message was lasting. It asserted that Holocaust memory was not confined to history books or commemorations, but was still active, still pursued by living agents against aging perpetrators. Governments balked, critics wrote, and survivors reacted, but the undeniable reality was presented in public view. A man accused of murdering thousands in Riga had been hunted and killed decades later, his guilt spelled out for any reader of the unsigned statement. The moral question, justice or extrajudicial violence, was left unresolved, lingering in editorials, diplomatic meetings, and legal discussions alike. The result was a paradox that defined perceptions of the operation. It projected both strength and secrecy, moral clarity and legal ambiguity. It was both a commemoration of forgotten victims and a violation of foreign sovereignty. Operation Damocles, as it became known in public discourse, sustained attention not because of its covert details, but because of the contradictions it embodied. Governments, survivor communities, and commentators were forced to grapple with its implications. Did the manner of his death serve history or undermine law? Could assassination be counted as justice when courts had failed? These were questions without easy resolution. The effect extended well beyond the villa or the pages of the anonymous declaration. It created a debate that touched issues of international law, the credibility of survivor testimony, the responsibility of states to prosecute atrocities, and the legitimacy of clandestine retribution. Those debates did not close with the burial of Herbert Cukurs. They carried forward, shaping how post-war societies understood justice and how intelligence services weighed future operations. And it was within that unresolved tension that the larger legacy began to emerge. The events in Montevideo spotlighted not only one man's crimes, but also the contested paths chosen to address them. From that point, the story of Cukurs became less about his individual fate and more about the broader question of how the world would respond to atrocities when conventional justice faltered. Legacy of extrajudicial justice. The killing of Herbert Cukurs forced the world to confront a dilemma that remains unresolved. Should justice for atrocity be delivered through formal trial or through extrajudicial killing? That single question defined the legacy of Operation Damocles more than any detail of planning or execution. It was not only about one man in Montevideo. It was about the balance between visibility in the courtroom and certainty outside of it. One vision held up the trial as the moral standard. Eichmann's capture and trial in 1961 had shown the enormous power of bringing perpetrators before court. Survivors told their stories. Evidence reached the public record. The world learned in detail what the Holocaust meant in lived experience. Legal procedure conferred legitimacy to an otherwise extraordinary act of kidnapping. Trials also gave perpetrators the chance to be confronted by those who had survived their crimes and established a lasting documentary record to guard against denial. In this view, only a court could transform fleeting vengeance into history that nations and future generations could accept as fact. The other position emphasized the limits of law when fugitives lived abroad. Trials required a cooperative host country, robust documentation, and time, commodities often unavailable. Every year of delay deepened the risk that survivors would pass away without ever speaking, while perpetrators blended into ordinary lives or died comfortably in exile. In regions with weak or hostile governments, the hope of extradition was slim. Critics of patience pointed to South America, where dozens of Nazi fugitives lived with impunity, some under their own names. For them, the assassination of Cukurs was not a defiance of law, but a blunt correction for years in which law had failed. From this perspective, action carried certainty where legal procedure carried paralysis. The debate did not stay confined to the 1960s. Historians and practitioners alike argue that the shock of operations, such as the killing of Cukurs, contributed to later institutional reforms. By the 1990s, the international community struggled to respond to new instances of mass killing in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Governments recalled how survivor frustration and unilateral action had filled the gap left by legal institutions in the 1960s. Out of those concerns came the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in 1993 and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1994. A decade later, the Permanent International Criminal Court was established in 2002. Each of these institutions was designed in part to prevent states from deciding alone what justice looked like, to create a process where tribunals could act instead of intelligence services. The assassination of Cukurs and similar episodes stood as reference points during those debates, examples of what happened when the international system had no alternative to unilateral force. For Israel, the impact reached inward as well as outward. Operation Damocles demonstrated that targeted assassination could serve not just as punishment, but as message. The decision to leave documents with the body showed that killing had been paired with communication, to survivors, to other fugitives, and to foreign governments. It was less about secrecy than about leaving behind an undeniable signature, an anonymous signature, but one that no analyst truly doubted. The operation blurred lines between intelligence work and political statement. In the decades that followed, Israel, and later other nations, adapted targeted killings as both tactical tools and symbolic gestures, extending the precedent beyond Nazi hunting into later conflicts shaped by terrorism and insurgency. This legacy also echoed through survivor communities. For many who had waited decades for justice, the sight of Cukurs in South America was unbearable. His killing convinced some that memory would not be lost, even if international law failed. Yet others, including survivors themselves, lamented the absence of a trial that might have established his crimes with clarity and permanence. Survivors' testimonies carried extraordinary moral weight, and many feared that an assassination, however satisfying, risked leaving questions unanswered in the historical record. The division among survivors mirrored the broader debate among states. Vengeance offered closure for some, but closure without clarity for others. The ethical divide extended into international law. Critics argued that assassination, however justified against men like Cukurs, could normalize violence as a substitute for legal remedy. If one state could justify an execution in Uruguay, then another could claim the same right elsewhere under weaker pretenses. In an already fractured Cold War world, the fear was that targeted killing could cascade into abuse, with little to restrain states from citing justice for their own political enemies. Supporters countered that leaving perpetrators unchallenged normalized something worse: impunity. Every year fugitives moved freely was a silent declaration that memory need not carry consequence. Between these two risks, governments found no easy place to stand. The Cukurs operation, therefore, exists in history as a paradox. It was proof that assassination could deliver certainty where trials might falter. Yet it was also proof that certainty could come at the cost of legitimacy, producing debates that extended far beyond Israel and Uruguay. Later tribunals and the ICC were designed in recognition of that paradox, that without courts capable of action, states would be driven back to unilateral operations and clandestine violence. Extrajudicial justice thus carried both a warning and a model, shaping how nations designed international law for decades to come. From a military and intelligence perspective, Cukurs' death exemplified the trade-off: certainty achieved through decisive action against the risk of political backlash, sovereign violation, and erosion of legal norms. States that value justice and also value the rule of law continue to weigh these factors. The dilemma is not remote or academic, but practical, recurring in decisions about how to address fugitives in Syria, Ukraine, or Sudan, where courts have been slow and survivors impatient. This dual legacy, between law and clandestine power, was the true mark left by Operation Damocles. The memory of Riga's massacres, the politics of Cold War intelligence, the birth of international tribunals, and the question of sovereign accountability all intersected in the trunks and streets of Montevideo. What remained afterward was not only the story of a mission, but the challenge it posed to every government that claimed to uphold law while confronting atrocity. And in that challenge lay the enduring legacy of extrajudicial justice. Not a closed case, not even a resolved debate, but a question that carries forward, still shaping how societies answer demands for accountability when the normal mechanisms of law appear to fail. Operation Damocles was never only about Herbert Cukurs. His assassination became a statement about how states respond when perpetrators of mass violence live openly without formal consequence. It crystallized the dilemma that still defines debates on justice. Should history be set down through public trials, with testimonies preserved for record, or through covert actions that guarantee certainty but bypass the authority of law? As of 2025, prosecutors and Nazi hunters still debate whether all perpetrators have been found. Many cases remain open or were closed without conviction. This is why the question Cukurs posed still matters. Which is the lesser evil, trial or targeted killing? Tell us in the comments and explain your reasoning. And if you value deep case studies like this, remember to subscribe for more. Footnote for producers: any claim about recently declassified Mossad documents or named files must be verified and sourced before broadcast. If such sourcing is unavailable in the background research, rephrase cautiously.